So we've been going through Genesis, the first 3 chapters, a whole lot. And hopefully there's something that we've started to see here that we're now taking in and really applying it and just letting it be a part of us. And
There's been a progression, right?
correct,
To this whole story.
yes. And there's this idea that, especially within Genesis 1 and 2, there's a story there
Right.
that God is laying out that's to be trusted. We can trust that. And,
Right, the invitation. We get to trust the story.
Trust the story. And
Right.
then there's a creation that's a beautiful, wonderful thing. It's bathed in God. And God is all the way through it, all the way within it. And then there's us.
Right.
And creating in his image, and not just that we resemble him in some way, but also that we carry value and worth, and we don't have to go seeking it from other places.
Right.
And now we hit this point where there's a turn all of a
Right.
sudden.
Right. You've got this beautiful painting
Yes.
of like a good God with a good creation, good people, and we get to trust the story. And then the moment
And then
happens.
Genesis 3 hits us.
Yeah, I know.
And this moment, this turn, where all of a sudden we get this conversation between Eve and the serpent. And we know Adam's there too, so he is just
a part of
couple.
this.
He
Yeah,
is a
for
part of
sure.
it. And there's this conversation, and what the serpent starts to do is plant some seeds of doubt.
I know we always think of the serpent as like this, like, because tradition tells us it's Satan, so we always think like it's this like really bad, mischievous, awful thing. But if you really go back and you look at what the serpent does, the serpent doesn't do anything extraordinary in this.
No.
But that's because the serpent doesn't have to do something extraordinary.
Sure doesn't. There's something there that we already are tapping into.
Right, like a way that we were talking about this a little bit ago. A way that we would describe it is all he had to do was plant one seed of uncertainty, and then human beings had everything they needed to just water it like crazy. is like a way of looking at it.
And the way he did that, though, was so, if you remember, when we read through, Genesis 2, where God says, don't eat from this tree. If you
Right.
eat from this tree, then you will surely die. We can get into what all that means
Right.
at some point.
Right.
But we just know that God says that. And when the serpent talks to Eve, it's all about now, can we even touch this tree? Which
Right.
God didn't even talk about.
Right.
And, the serpent says, did he really say you would die if you... And she said, well, if we touch this tree, which he never said.
Right. Well, and think about it too. All he does is ask one question. Like one question. Did he really say? Which that's not a sinful question at that moment. Like as the way we think about things. Like don't get me wrong. I'm not saying it's great. It's just one seemingly harmless question. Did he really say that if you touched the tree or ate of the fruit, like that, then you're going to die? And the reality is, no, right? That's not what God said. But all that question does is it plants a moment in Eve's head and in Adam's head where now they're for the first time in human existence standing there going, wait, can I trust this story? Like,
And in that question, can I trust the story? And if I can't, it changes the way they actually look at that tree and,
Right.
and examine that tree and engage
exactly.
with that tree.
Yeah. All of a sudden they're going, wait, does God really have my back? Can I really trust him to be my God and us as his people? Is this really true what he's saying? And the uncertainty piece, because human beings struggle with uncertainty. And if you're not keenly aware of that as a human, just pause for 2 seconds. Anytime you have a deep sense where like something you are uncertain about something that really matters to you, that is a difficult place for us to be in. We don't usually thrive in that environment.
Definitely not.
Right. And so there's a part where that all that had to do is plant that one little piece, and the next thing you know, they're starting to shift from trusting God's story to shifting to go, I want to see it for myself. I want to know it for myself. And so what do you
So
say?
doesn't that change the way we read that passage where right before they eat it, she looks at it and it's good to eat, but also it's desirable for wisdom and it will make them like God.
Right.
And so now there's this, if you start thinking about stories and what do we trust, that takes on a whole new idea for us.
Right. So the seed of uncertainty gets planted. She walks up to the tree. He walks up to the tree. Why? Because rather than trust God, rather than trust his story, good God, good garden, good people, and we can have life with him, now it's, I want to see it for myself. And so what does she do? They look at the fruit and she goes, I see that it's desirable. I want it. It spokes my desire. I see that it's good for food. Wait, maybe this has benefits that God wasn't letting me in on. Maybe this is tasty and he's holding out on me. Maybe I don't have what I need. And then the last one, I sees that it's beneficial for wisdom. maybe I'll learn something here that God doesn't want me to know. Or maybe there's something here for me to learn that will make me, and this is what the story tells us, like God. And if you think about that, that shifts, this is powerful, you guys. This has the power to shift the entire story, and this is what it does. They start in a story that is God's story, that he's been telling. Good God, good creation, good people, life with God. And a moment of uncertainty comes along, and they shift out of that story, and they begin the ones telling the story. They stop trusting his, and they go, I'm no longer going to trust the story of life with God. The story I want to tell is life where I am like God, or life as God. I'm going to see it with my own eyes. I'm going to know it for myself. I'm going to decide. And so much of the rest of the story is human beings being crushed under the weight of trying to be like God and simply not being big enough to carry it. When Adam and Eve eat of the fruit in the garden, it says that their eyes were going to be opened, and sure enough, their eyes were. And they suddenly gain a kind of awareness that they didn't have before, and you see this impact them in a really deep way.
What sort of awareness?
So, three things actually here. They become aware of their own insecurity. They become aware of their own fear. We're going to unpack these in just a moment. And they become aware of shame for the very first time in the story. They didn't have any of this. Before, they could just trust the story. Good God, good people. He loves them, created them to live out of the fullness of who they are, all the things that we've been talking about in the last couple of weeks. And they can live in a sense of trust out of that. Now, they start telling their story. They stop trusting the story, and they start saying, no, we're going to tell our story. We're going to eat the fruit. We're going to see for ourselves. We are going to trust in the knowledge, our own knowledge of good and evil, and see how this thing goes.
Weirdly enough, that starts to make life harder than easier.
Right.
You know more and you're more aware, and that actually is far more difficult to navigate.
Right, because it's easier to trust God. The thing with that, though, is we can look and be like, because it's harder, easier. It makes sense that it would be so much harder. We're made by God, created to live in relationship with him. And in a weird way, it's like grinding the gears of creation for us to go, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to live life as God. We're going to stop trusting the story. We're going to tell our own.
And so with that, I want to go back to, we said there were three things that come out of that awareness.
Right.
That we would say uncertainty births.
Right.
Three different things. And that first one was insecurity.
Right.
And, when we read the story, they eat it, and then all of a sudden, they become aware of that they're naked. It says...
Yeah, it's the very first thing, right?
The first thing, we're naked. And it wasn't this overjoyous response of, look at, how great I look, but rather... I got to start covering up.
Right. Even later, God's response to them is, who told you were naked? Like, where did that idea even come from? Nakedness isn't a thing that God created in terms of the awareness of it. They didn't need an awareness of it before. They were loved and fine and okay.
And the thing, this sounds kind of jokey, but like, you have to imagine this is a perfect garden. They've been walking around. So it's not as if, they're these just like,
protective measures and all these things.
It's not as if like I imagine like they're not going to look down and be like, man, I let myself go. Like,
yeah, what does that even mean?
Exactly.
Nobody knows what that is.
So it can't be just like, oh, I don't like the way I look.
No. When they see themselves as naked, think of it this way. Think of it as a far deeper question where for the first time and actually we might be more in tune with this question in ourselves than we're honest to sometimes. Think of it as Adam and Eve finally having their eyes open, looking at themselves, and out of their own story, out of their own understanding, they look and they go, is this okay? Is who I am okay? Do you feel the insecurity? Do you feel that moment beginning to come out? And what is their response? They're naked and they go, I've got to hide this. I've got to cover it up. And so they go and they make themselves close.
So essentially they're looking at their entirety.
Yeah.
The entirety of themselves. And is the entirety of myself okay?
They've lost the story. They're stuck in their own.
Yeah. And so I'm going to cover up what I think is not okay.
Right. So think of the moments in your life that you have struggled with insecurity the most. I can guarantee you somewhere in that struggle, there's a larger story of a God who loves you, who made you completely enough, who is walking with you, who has good things for you, right? Good God, good garden, all the things. But you're struggling to trust this story. And as you step into, wait, I think I got to tell my own story here because I don't know if I can put both feet in God's story. What starts to come out of that? I don't know that I'm enough. I don't know that I can. I don't know that this is okay. And we begin to compensate, and that starts to get really, really hard. We start to hide ourselves. We live diminished lives, and it's really, really complicated. We see this from the very beginning with Adam and Eve. That's the first one, insecurity.
And the second one, which kind of just dovetails and ties right to it,
Right.
is this idea of fear.
Right.
And we read about how God comes, he's walking in the garden.
Right.
And this is something that we have to imagine he does with them all the time. He walks with them in the garden all the time, and all of a sudden they're not there.
Yeah, at the very least, we're not led to believe that this is abnormal that God would walk in the garden,
Like,
right?
They're not surprised by this.
Right.
Where did he come from?
But what do?
They run and they hide, and he says, where are you?
Mm-hmm.
And they talk about, well, we hid because we're afraid.
Right. So God's walking in the garden, and they suddenly go, and they had a relationship with him. They've connected with God. They know this. But for the first time now, they have to ask the question, wait, should I be scared of God now? Should I be afraid of God now? Is God going to be okay with me? Fear enters into the equation, and they make their decision based out of fear. Once again, they could have had the opportunity to trust the story. God wouldn't have had to say, where are you? But fear begins to tell the story, right? As they live this out, and they go hide in the bushes. And I think we feel the same things. In the moments that you've struggled the most, you tend to hide from the people around you. You tend to hide from yourself. And we even tend to hide from God, which is tough because we've talked about it being absolutely everywhere and in all of this. But we still live this out. We play this out. This is part of what we see when uncertainty takes root and we act out of our own story instead of trusting God's.
I can think of the times where maybe we're supposed to have a hard conversation with somebody, right, or just I knew I had messed up, or just I realized something about myself that I wasn't super proud of, and I can literally imagine and think back to where I would withdraw,
right,
and I didn't want to be around people in case they would see that,
right.
I was, the hard conversation, is that going to hurt me,
right,
and I don't want to engage with that. I'm scared of them.
Right.
What's it gonna mean? So.
Those things start to tell our story. They never did before. And then the third one is shame. And shame is perhaps the most insidious of these. And in some ways, shame might not even be a separate one. It might be what comes out of living life, out of the fear, the insecurity, or all of these things. But you clearly see shame in this story because when they go to hide in the bushes and God finds them, one of the first things they do is blame the other person. So Adam blames Eve.
Well, because he asked, who told you were naked?
Right.
Like, who told you this?
And Adam immediately, instead of him being like, so I did a thing, Adam goes, she did this. She's the one who gave the fruit to me. And what does Eve do? The serpent is the one who did this.
Over there, yeah.
Right. So you can look at that as like a comical blame moment in an ancient story. You can also look at this as the moment where you go, I am so uncomfortable with the attention being directed at me and the shame that I feel that I divert it away and I point the finger at somebody else. And I'm essentially saying, no, not me. When you're proud of your choices, when you have no shame, you don't blame. Blame is indicative of the fact that there's some part of themselves that they're suddenly not okay with, and they're trying to divert the attention to somewhere else. And we feel this too, I think, at different moments in our own lives, where maybe you've experienced a moment where you're not proud of yourself. Maybe you've got a past or a story. We all do in some places and moments. And that like lives with you in a way where you try to hide from it. Part of you is not okay with this. You carry the sense of weight and shame. And I think each of us have understandings of that. There was none of this in the story and until people started writing their own. When you trust the story of a good God who loves you right where you are, who meets you right in the midst of this moment, who has a good garden and a good life, there's freedom to be lived out of. When you take that upon yourself and you start going, no, I'm going to trust in my own knowledge. I'm going to take my own uncertainty and answer my own things and do this in this particular way. It starts to brood these things that compound, and that gets really, really difficult.
Oh,
it's hard.
Yeah, it's difficult for sure.
Yeah.
So we've kind of arrived at the end of this story that we've been following. And we're here in Genesis 3, and you started in verse 14. And what's interesting about this passage here is that there's really kind of been two ways people have viewed this or tried to understand it. And I know that you tend to lean towards one way more than the other.
I do. And both take you to somewhat similar place. But, the way that I look at this is you get to the end of the story, and here's the first way that you can look at it is, God looks and he's like, you disobeyed me, and now I'm going to punish you. And you are kicked out, and there's consequence, and all these terrible things are...
And it's like God is angry at you for...
Right. He is mad. Yeah. He is like, how dare you? And get out.
And if you understand it that way, though, then you've got to live as if God has been angry for a long time.
Really, really, really long time, right? And you get a lot of theology based on some of that stuff. You know, at one point in time in seminary, there was another way that was presented to me. And it really resonated with me because it seems consistent with who Christ is, which anytime I see something really consistent with who Christ is, it helps me to trust the larger story in this. And what that is I see that as this story ends, you have humanity make some choices and to choose rather than life with God, to live life as God, right? Life like God, life as God, which is different because when you're life with God, God's here and you're just engaged in that relationship. Life as God, you're actually living like you don't need him in the same way. You're not living in that same relationship. And so this is God looking at humanity saying, if you're going to live life as God, and if you're going to take that weight upon your shoulders, you're going to live based on your own knowledge of good and evil, then this is going to get really hard for you because you're not God. You're just a human being. So, you know, when you go to till the soil,
it's going to be rough.
Right.
It's going to be backbreaking. And it really, this is essentially consequences, right?
correct, natural consequences.
Which seems almost, no, not almost, it is consistent with who God says he is and what he's given us in this idea of free will.
Right. Yeah, so if you go to till the soil, you don't control the weather and all the means that you need to make that happen. You're a finite human being and not the God of the universe. That's going to get really problematic and really hard in moments for you. You're going to struggle in childbearing, which is one of the most uncertain events. We have the luxury of modern hospitals and things.
It's not been that way for a long time.
No, for most of human history, the largest killer of women was actually pregnancy. It was one of the scariest, most uncertain of events. This fits. You don't get to control the outcomes on all this. It's going to go good sometimes. It's going to go poor sometimes. When you live life as God, you're going to carry the weight of this, and it's going to get really heavy and really, really tough.
What's funny is you're trying to live life as God, and you just realize more and more that you are not God.
Right. And why can't they stay in the garden? Because you can't stay in the garden, which is a world created, an arena created for you to live life with God, if you've chosen to completely ignore that story and that equation and choose something else. You're going to go it alone. You're going to go create your own universe, more or less. And I don't mean physically. I just mean your own way of being. You're going to go start telling your own story, and you're going to reap a bunch of consequences from that because you've cut yourself off from the garden. The gates are shut.
It's as if you've chosen it. Like there's a part where when you want to be God, you don't want to live with God.
That's correct.
Exactly.
And he's kind of going, okay, then enjoy living with what you just asked for.
Exactly.
That's in there. So see, there's a couple ways to take that. But here's the thing. Either way, no matter what, at this moment, this story gets really difficult, right? You've had this good God, good creation, beautiful story, trust in him, great garden, all of these things, living up to this at this point in time. And now all of a sudden you have mankind going it alone in one regard, trying to live their own life as God. I think God's in pursuit. I think he's with. We've talked about some of that, but you really have mankind stepping out into the difficulty that's in front of them, and it seems like the story gets a little sad or a little hard right here. And it would be easy to end Genesis 3 and just go, well, gosh, this is going to be rough from here on out. And that's why I'm so grateful. You know, one of my favorite passages in all of Scripture actually occurs right here at the very beginning of your Bible, in Genesis 3, in the moment that the story gets really difficult. And it's actually found in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. And I knew you were going to read that for us.
You just read it, but it's important enough to hear it again. Again, God is talking to the serpent here. And here's what he says in verse 15. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring.
Right.
He shall crush your head, and you shall bruise his heel.
So, and you're reading from the NIV there, right?
Yes.
Right. So think about what just happened when you read through that passage. You have God looking at Satan, who created the moment of uncertainty and basically created he essentially proposed a counter story from the one God had been telling, right? He's like, you don't have to trust this. What if there's another story, more or less? And they started to do this. So God goes to Satan and he goes, all right, this is going to get really difficult for you between you and the woman. And one day she is going to have an offspring. And that offspring is, you are going to bruise his heel. Now, if I strike your heel, Seth, is that going to be a deathly blow?
No, I'm going to be mad at you.
Right.
But, you know, I'll probably survive unless you're like a really good ninja.
I could wound you.
Yes.
I could disable you.
Sure.
I mean, bad things, terrible things could happen.
Of course, yeah.
But it's highly unlikely that that's a finishing blow, so to speak.
I've never heard of somebody dying from a heel blow.
The great heel striker.
Yes.
Exactly. No, So this is what Satan's going to do to the offspring. But then what does it say? The offspring of the woman is going to strike his head. The NIV is going to read crush his head. The ESV is going to read bruise his head. But either way, from an ancient culture, what do you think the difference between a head and a heel is going to be here?
Pretty big,
Right.
because the heel, like we said, you're not gonna, unless you're Achilles, you're not gonna die from that.
But a head wound.
A head wound, though, on the other hand, you want to stay away from those.
Right.
There's a high chance that if you get
Right.
crushed in the head,
Right.
you're not coming back from that.
So the belief here is that this is an articulation of like a finishing blow. This is what makes this believed to be one of the first, in fact, messianic prophecy in the whole Bible. What's happening here is that when the story gets dark, when things get hard, when mankind trusts his own story and it seems like the largest story of God has been lost, at that exact instance in the scriptures is the moment that God goes, no, there's absolutely hope, and I'm already in pursuit. And one day I'm going to send Jesus. And what he's going to come and do is he's going to step back into this conflictual garden moment with serpent and person and everything else. And though he'll be wounded, though he'll be hurt, it won't be his end, but he's going to finish this story here. And what does Jesus say when he's on the cross?
It is finished.
Exactly. There's a piece here. What Jesus is doing is he's saying we don't need to worry about being stuck in our own story anymore. We have full invitation to step back into trusting the larger story of God and live in the fullness of that again. And that's really good. Here's why this matters. And I love that you all have been, journeying through this week to week up to this point. Is maybe you're in a space where you've learned a lot, but the truth is in your own life, you're looking at this going, I don't know. I sometimes feel like maybe my story is far from God's story. Or maybe you've been sitting here wondering, like, what does it mean to have relationship with God? And is that story even available to me? Maybe you have a past and you think that somehow you're disqualified from some of these moments, or like God's far, or you can't get there. And the beautiful thing is from the very beginning, the thing that we get pointed to is that there's hope in this. And the good news is we live on this side of the cross and resurrection.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right. And so we get to step into telling that story again. You have a full invitation to live life back in the garden. There is freedom. There is acceptance, and there is love, right? Good God, good creation, who wants to do good things through who he created you to be as you engage and live in this world in freedom and in faith with him. And that's so much of our mission here. And so I'm actually really happy that you're here. I know we both are.
Me too. This trusting the story is so huge
Right.
to what our mission is, and empowers us and pushes us forward in that. And
Right.
So, like Ryan said, man, we're really glad that you're here. We're glad that you went through this with us. And we hope that you just keep living and stepping into our mission.
It's good to have you.